Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation, Ghosts in the Machine, Practice Meets Research, Developing a Training Workshop to Support Use of Web Archives in Arts and Humanities Research. So our first slide was an introduction to us. We're actually here in, the flesh. So, but that's us in case you needed to know again. So I'm going to talk, oh yes, the GIFs work. So I'm going to talk a little bit in the first part of this presentation about how we recognize the gaps for training. And I have these lovely horse GIFs because I too am from horse country. So much of our life and culture is online, and the web represents a significant part of daily life for everyone living in the 21st century, where we get our news, where we find information about health, where we learn about government policies, where we reach our friends and family, and where we share ideas and projects. And this, as I'm a design historian by training, so I'm interested in sort of material culture and particularly digital material culture. And this is sort of a new field of study in design history. It's something I've done quite a bit of work in, both within my PhD itself, but also sort of with some projects out with the PhD. My PhD thesis, which you can see the title here, investigates the role of communication design in shaping how information disorder is produced and mediated in the United States. And so when I was designing my PhD project, I was thinking about the shift from print to digital, and also sort of these other interests I have in sort of communication design and politics and media theory. So as part of my project, you'll see it's got quite a long timeline. So I'm have this diachronic study where I'm looking at the origins of sensationalism in 19th century sensationalist newspapers in the United States, which are digitized by the Library of Congress. And then also I'm looking at fake news websites. So these is a small selection from the Wayback Machine of some of the websites that I'm looking at, essentially. And so I went to go write my methodology section, and I ran into this problem, which was, how do you actually study these websites as a primary resource material? And I guess I'd like to point out also, I'm not just interested in studying these websites as textual sources. I'm very much looking at them as multimodal sources as a design historian. So I'm not only interested in the content, but I'm also interested in how they were designed and sort of the visual aspects of these websites. And so things like that came up earlier in the conference in terms of things like advertisements that don't get captured, things like that. These were some of these problems I was running into, and I was looking for documentation online about, well, then, what are like sort of the standards and best practice for researching these things? And there wasn't really anything. So I met Alice and Sara, which was really great. And we came up with this training workshop that we would do, which was sponsored by the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities. So the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities is a funding body. I don't know how familiar you all are with the way that the UK funding works, but you have sort of the UKRI and then the AHRC, and then within the AHRC, they sort of distribute funding to different regions. In Scotland, there's one consortium, and that's the SAGSA. And it's a doctoral training partnership. So they provide training for other doctoral students, both funded and non-funded students anywhere in Scotland. And so they had a call for doing a series of sort of international training events. And the contribution to the program should appeal to Scottish and international postgraduate researchers in the arts and humanities. And they would sort of fund anything we wanted. So this included catering and travel for researchers to come, which was really helpful. And so we put in a proposal for a training workshop that was about web archives for humanities researchers at a very basic level. And so we made some initial assumptions about what type of training is needed. And this was in part from my own experience and kind of saying, well, this is what I've run into, but then also through, these discussions that we all had about sort of more computational methods as well, which is something that I don't look at personally in my own research, but is useful for humanities researchers. So we came up with these sort of four main assumptions about what type of training was needed. And this is skills and understanding to use existing web archives and promote web archiving through your own research. So we very much saw this as, by attending the workshop, you do not only gain skills to use web archives in your own research, but in gaining those skills, you can then go out into the world and, be a prophet for web archives for other humanities researchers. We also wanted to sort of introduce what web archives are and where to access them, and also ethical and copyright issues, how they can be used in research generally, which maybe I already said, and have an understanding of basic computational methods and tools available to work with web archives as data. And And yes, so this was our Eventbrite with this lovely graphic. We called it Ghost in the Machine. We had little ghost pins. It was very good. Yeah.
It was delightfully spooky. So in terms of thinking about what we actually wanted to cover, we kind of took a Web Archives 101 approach. We realized we were dealing with quite a broad audience. So some people had used Web Archives, mostly the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine in their own research. Some people had no idea. We did have one or two people who came who had maybe misunderstood what we were talking about in terms of Web Archives. So
they
first,
knew by the end.
Yeah, well, yeah, they definitely knew by the end. So first of all, we kind of just covered why bother archiving the web, what Web Archives are, crucially what Web Archives are not. We introduced them to the basics of the kind of technical side, like what is a web crawl, and the different kinds of capture approaches. So the large scale sort of domain crawls versus the small curated collections or sort of individual collecting. We walked them through the practicalities. How might you actually find a source for your own research? How do you understand Web Archives across time? So sort of reading a URL. What are the characteristics of websites, of Web Archives? Why does that site look like that? And what maybe hasn't been picked up or in a crawl or isn't rendering in a way that you might expect if you've seen the live site? And then how do you actually use that in your research? Like, how do you cite an archived website? So very much the basics, but really crucial things if you're a researcher and you want to know how to actually put it into your PhD thesis. We talked them through some kind of research methods. So the part of a whole of a part kind of different approaches. We looked at doing close reading of content versus the distance reading of the structure. And as Anna said, we kind of introduced them to some very basic computational analysis tools. That was the plan, which Sarah will talk about a little bit more in a moment. We also wanted to focus on, this is my personal pet project, I suppose, the humanities bit, about thinking about the provenance of not just the site, but also of the crawl, and how those different factors might influence what resources are actually available for you to use. So kind of making them thinking about archives as objects, as we were talking about a little bit this morning. We also talked about how well you can use Web Archives to extrapolate and kind of make conclusions from. It's very difficult to know if you have an archived website, how much reach did it actually have at the time when it was live? We don't have those delightful counters, visitor counters so much anymore, which I really wish we did. So how much influence did a site actually have at the time? So we thought these were all kind of important things to think about in any Web Archives research, but specifically for humanities students, we wanted them to kind of come armed with these questions. We also looked at some of the legal and ethical considerations, so the impact of international, national and local legislation. How are the crawls performed, in what context, and how do those interact with platform terms and conditions? We wanted to get them thinking about what people might expect of their content and how that might have been archived, and also how that interacts with their own institutional ethics policies. We did this by using lots and lots of examples. We had a wonderful keynote by Dr. Katie McKinnon, who talked about her own research in using archived youth data in the marginal web. Anna introduced her research as well. And I was able to talk about the curation and rights management that we did as part of the Talking About Health collection. We wanted it to be hands-on and active to get them sort of thinking, but also using Web Archives. So we had a descriptive metadata activity where we asked them to think about trying to describe a archived web resource. And we also had an ethical deliberation activity, getting them to think again about the kind of ethical concerns and issues involved in using specifically social media.
Right, so some lessons learned. You may have noticed from what Alice just went through that we covered a lot of ground. So I think our approach was that we kind of assumed most of the graduate students attending probably had not been exposed to any sort of training in the past for methodologies of using the archived web. So we wanted to sort of give them a little taste of everything, but we would not do that again. We would not try to cover so much ground. So one big thing is with the computational methods, we wanted lowest barrier to entry possible. We knew anecdotally that humanities and arts students feel quite intimidated by trying to learn computational skills. So I wanted to use tools they could just sit down on their laptop and use. But unfortunately, about a week before this session, one of my favorite tools for showing this, the UK Web Archive's Trends tool, part of the sort of Shine toolkit, went down due to the cyber attack. And also mybinder.org was running at reduced capacity. I could not get my normal sort of demos to work in the GLAM workbench, which is another project that the UK Web Archive is involved in. So unfortunately, I had to just use a bunch of screenshots that I have collected over the years doing training, which is not as effective as getting students to actually, okay, now you open this and run this on your machine, open this Jupyter notebook. Don't worry about what that is, just open it. Put in the website that you're thinking of comparing over time and getting them to actually engage. So it just wasn't as effective. So I think we don't really have a solution for this except to say moving forward, as we collect this data by running these training sessions, seeing the demand for it, trying to find ways that we can help support these sort of open access, open resources as well, because somebody has to maintain them and keep them running. They were very interested, not surprising, as humanities students, in what are these institutions archiving the web? How did they come to be? So Ian Milligan's talk was very interesting. We'll definitely be mining that for sort of a new session on the who and the where of web archives, seeing more faces, understanding the motivations behind this. There are a lot of, what about I want to do this specific thing in my research, I'm looking at this really obscure thing you've never heard of. And we're actually partially addressing this. Anna and Alice will be delivering a sort of surgeries workshop that has a little introduction to web archives, but is really designed for researchers to bring questions about their own research to sort of find out if web archives might be useful for them. Because this really did turn into a little bit of a surgery itself, sort of answering specific questions about specific research projects. Also, interestingly, many of them, once learning about web archiving, became really keen to archive their own websites. So either research project websites or other projects they were working on that had a sort of web-based output. And we have started to integrate this training into other training modules at the university. So we offer ongoing training in using the web recorder tools. And we've also started integrating DIY web archiving into existing training for researchers through the research data management team, which is actually how we first met Anna, which was amazing. So we'll keep doing that for sure. But we'll be doing more of that. Also, the case study was very interesting. Researchers love to hear from other researchers. I think this really brought to life for them how they might use web archives in their own research. And Katie was absolutely brilliant talking about using particularly quite a sensitive and nostalgic type of resource, looking at sort of 1990s sort of pre-social networking platform in Canada that I can't remember the name of, but I think that really remembering those early days on the web was quite nostalgic and was a very useful case study in this case. I love that all the GIFs are working, because otherwise that's just a big black square. Lots and lots of questions, as you can expect, about the ethics of using social media data, having lots of researchers learning about these terms and conditions of platforms, some for the first time, be like, excuse me, but to do research properly and robustly, I'm going to have to violate these terms and conditions. And we're like, yes, good, well observed. So one interesting question was they wanted to know what the university's policy was in relation to platform terms and conditions. And I thought this was a very interesting question as well. So that's the last slide. We did it. Well done, team.
Wow. Excellent. Okay, so Anna, Alice and Sarah, thank you very much.